Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our inaugural Curated Collisions event at Northeastern University. My name is Carmen Shepa, Dean of Bouvet College of Health Sciences. The vision of Bouvet is to be the leader in shaping and driving the transformation of healthcare to health span. And by that we mean living in good health despite the presence of risk factors, disease, and disability. This vision contrasts with the more reactive styles dominating much of today's healthcare system. Reimagining healthcare, particularly when extremely challenged by the unexpected, like the COVID-19 pandemic we are living through, requires an innovative and entrepreneurial mindset that considers the individual, society, industry, and the economy. Bouvet's Health Sciences Entrepreneurs Program embodies that mindset, promoting health sciences innovation and mentoring the next generation of entrepreneurs and leaders within Northeastern's global system and beyond. Founded in 2005, HSC focuses on developing the individual entrepreneur rather than the idea, and catalyzing collaboration to accelerate the implementation of novel ideas. In short, Bouvet's Health Sciences Entrepreneurs Program mission and collective expertise is strategically placed to convene today's gathering and foster ongoing conversations. Before moving into today's program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues in the steering committee, led by Rupal Patel, professor at Northeastern University and founder and CEO of VocaliD ID. Lori Bishop, who you saw initially, Health Science Entrepreneurs Program Manager, and Jean Tunick, Associate Dean of Research and Innovation for Bouvet and professor at Northeastern University. I'd also like to acknowledge Bouvet alumnus and HSC mentor, Stuart Hemingway, Vice President and Global Health of Regulatory Affairs at Bridge Bio Inc. in Palo Alto, California. Bridge Bio has generously sponsored this meeting today, and we are grateful for their support. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I want to recognize and thank all of the members and the board of the Bouvet College's Health Science Entrepreneurs Program for their wisdom, guidance, and great efforts to coordinate and convene today's inaugural Curated Collisions event. We look forward to our continued partnership to host additional gatherings to build and reinforce our collective network and our thought leadership. Now, I will turn it over to Rupal, our MC for today's program, who will provide an introduction and overview. Enjoy, everyone, and thank you again for your participation.
Thank you, Carmen, and welcome everyone. I see that we have Zoomfuls or screenfuls of attendees, which is exciting. December 10th is not always the most convenient time, given that we're all planning for year end, but I hope that it's also a time for us to reflect upon the year. It's been a heck of a year, right? There's been so many things that have happened this year, and it's oftentimes we've been really just drinking from the fire hose. We've just been putting out fires and trying to figure out how exactly we can manage in this time, which has been so tumultuous. So as leaders, as educators, as innovators in your field and entrepreneurs, we hope that you can take the time today, you've registered, you're here, to reflect, to enjoy, to meet people, and to really open your horizons to what we can do in 2021. So the title of this meeting was looking at 2020 with hindsight and looking upon 2021 with more vision for the future. So why curated collisions? Well, curated collisions, if you remember back in science, remember Brownian motion? So Brownian motion is random collisions. And that used to happen when we went to the office or when we were at conferences and so on, where we actually had the opportunity to meet people. And those random, spontaneous collisions were really exciting, and they spawned off different kinds of collaborations, and it opened up your mind to things. In the Zoom world, it's hard for us to do that. So we want these to be more curated collisions because we can't fit 10 screenfuls of Zoom. And so what we decided to do at today's event is that we're gonna have 4 outstanding speakers who are going to get us kicked off, get all the kinks out of our brain in terms of all the other things that are happening, and really focus on these incredible speakers that we've lined up. After that, we'll break into breakout sessions, each half an hour parallel sessions, where you'll have a chance to interact. We want you to interact. This is not just a meeting where you're speaking or being spoken to. We really want you to engage in the interactions, and there we would like you to be as interactive as possible. Use the chat even during this session, but certainly turn your cameras on and be part of those interactions. That's how you're going to get the most of this this afternoon. So without further ado, I would like to first do some housekeeping. We've already talked about a few of those things. Please use the chat as much as you can. The session will be recorded, so you do not need to take notes. You can go back, and especially in the breakout sessions, if you really want to be in a different session, we tried our best to get people in the sessions that they wanted to, but sometimes it's also important to kind of break people up so that we also have the opportunity to have equal participation across. So please know that they are going to be recorded, and we will have a chance to view those later. So our first speaker today is Stas Gayshan. Stas is the managing director of CIC, which is the Cambridge Innovation Center, and he's the founder of CIC Boston. He's an entrepreneur. He is also an attorney. He's also had a lot of hands in the Democratic political campaigns. He's been, and so no wonder that he's also been named by Boston Globe one of the most innovative people in Massachusetts. So without further ado, I will heed the floor to you, Stas. Take it away.
Thanks for that introduction. Very kind of you, and really glad to be here. I think one of the first foundational questions everyone here should ask is, what the hell are you doing at a conversation about healthcare? And I think the easiest answer to that is that CAC, the Cambridge Innovation Center, where I've been for now almost 7 years, when we went to think about how to respond to the COVID pandemic, we said we think it makes sense to build a testing environment to make sure that our offices are following a number of protocols to be safe in an era of COVID. And then looking at that, we thought that testing would be a critical part of this picture. And if you've seen the images of Swiss cheese, thinking about safety as many layers of Swiss cheese, lots of holes, but if you stack the layers one on top of the other, the holes don't match up and you get a block that you can't see through. So this has been a foundational idea for us as we thought about how do we keep our offices safe and the people in them safer. And we went out to try to figure out how to do COVID testing, how we could get some for our office, and found that the market was for getting it was very difficult. And it was fragmented, and we simply weren't able to buy it. So in May, CIC started a company called CIC Health to see if we could smooth out the process. And over the last few months, I've become its general counsel, putting those legal skills to work. It's been a really, really interesting journey in the world of healthcare because we are not ourselves involved in healthcare. Well, what we are doing is the logistics of healthcare. And I think for a lot of folks, just the idea of the word logistics sounds incredibly boring. Like, who cares how you get things from point A to point B? Let's talk about doing the things. But it turns out that when you want to do things, thinking about how things get from point A to point B in order to be done is actually really critical. And if you don't get the logistics right, nothing else happens. I recognize it's the holiday season with the start of a number of holidays this month. But as we kind of think about this, it's amazing how many of our holidays are actually based off of miracles of logistics. So whether it's the miracle of a lamp with 1 day supply of oil lasting 8 whole days, or the single purpose person who delivers presents all over the world. I think most of the holidays of December are actual holidays of logistics. And in fact, the season kicks off with Thanksgiving, a holiday of having enough to eat to make it through the winter. So obviously 2020 is a year where holidays are not like what they are, but what I think is common both before and after is how we do things is the first question in what we do. And kind of if you look at this, one of the questions that I have been particularly obsessed about as we think about what happens in innovation is that the folks who solve the logistics problems are actually making really the changes. And for us, CAC Health has now facilitated more than 300,000 COVID tests since we started working on that supply chain in May and really got the first tests going sometime in August. And we think that this is a really critical thing to do because for us as a society, we get back and towards something closer to normal, we have to make sure that the world is safe. And the way to make sure it's safe is to check, verify, and move on. And we're kind of excited to be playing in that field, really helping people build safer workplaces, safer communities, safer hospitals, safer schools, and so on and so forth. But for me, the thing that keeps me really engaged in this is a fundamental question around how do we think about innovation for the future? And that, for me, the interesting bit about thinking about innovation is really thinking about how we predict the future and what we think we know versus what the world actually turns out to be. So the most easy way to look at this is to look at how people predict and how people look at questions about the future, how they predict them, and then say, okay, what can we learn from that? So a typical format of prediction is this. Somebody looks at the general underlying assumptions that are true today, and they say, if we follow these underlying assumptions out to the future, the pace of change will be incremental, and that we should assume that, if something costs X today and costs fall by 5% a year, then it will drop by 5% next year, and 5% next year, and 5% next year. And so we should make an assumption that things will be slowly improving in the schedule. And I think you see this kind of thinking in lots of reporting about science, innovation, and engineering. But the reality is a little bit more complicated because it turns out that if the given assumptions are challenged, then lots of things move quickly. So I think what you heard in the beginning of this year in January is people saying, look, the last time the world developed a vaccine, it took 10 years. And the reason it took 10 years is because X, Y, and Z had to happen. And if we do X faster, Y faster, and Z faster, then maybe we can cut this process down to 5. So there will be no vaccine for COVID until 2025. But if we can go really quickly, then maybe 2022 or 2023. So here we are at the end of 2020, a year that started with a virus and is ending with a vaccine being approved and lots more in the pipeline. And it's pretty clear that if you challenge the fundamental assumptions true about something, then maybe all the old things don't have to be that way. And I think the most interesting thing, I read in an article a couple of days ago, that technologically the vaccine itself was actually prepared by March. And what we've been doing since March is actually testing it for efficacy and safety. And so if we could rethink that piece of the process, then potentially the next time something like a global pandemic happens, the process could be faster still. So now we go in 1 year, we cut that timeline and say, okay, maybe it doesn't take 10 years to develop a solution, but maybe it takes 10 months. And the next time, maybe it doesn't take 10 months, but it takes 10 days. And if you kind of think about the history of human change and growth as driving that way, we're going to see a lot of changes happen exponentially and then sequentially, and then exponentially and then sequentially. So first the big change happens, and then the changes that follow. Then the big change happens, and then the changes that follow. And so we saw this in vaccines, but something similar has happened with our phones. If you think about what a smartphone looked like 12 years ago and what a smartphone looks like today, it's incomparable. And if you think about the world enabled by smartphones 12 years later, it's funny to think about it, but it was, in 2007, most phones didn't have web access. And today we can't think about the internet unless we think about phones first, right? So this for me is a very, very exciting thing. And I'm excited to be here talking about kind of the way that innovation happens and where it's going. I'm really excited to be very, very wrong, but use the framework that hindsight is 2020. And since 2020 is 2020, I'm looking forward to looking back at this conversation in a decade and thinking about what's next.
Great, thank you, Stas. And I'm grateful that you did stand up CIC Health, given that my kids actually are using CIC Health in their school for the testing, and it does give a lot of relief in terms of just knowing that they can get back to school again. And it's really interesting to think about repurposing infrastructure, right? Like why and how that was possible, and why it was possible. Why now? What was the perfect storm? And that really leads nicely into what Satish Tadikonda is going to talk about. Satish is again, a serial entrepreneur. Satish has had so many roles in various different companies, including founder and CEO and executive member. He's actually the executive fellow at the Rock Center at Harvard Business School, and he's the managing partner of Avigo Solutions, a health IT company. And he also focuses a lot on mentorship. Satish is a part of the Thai Boston group as well. And what's really interesting is he's going to tell us about why this was the perfect time. If there was a perfect time to have a pandemic, rather now than 1980. Satish.
Thank you, Rupal, and a fantastic setup, Stas, actually, right? Like if you look at what has happened in COVID, not only the magnitude of change, right, but also the compression of time in a lot of the activities that have occurred. But in order for a number of those things to occur, you got to look back, right, a little bit about what teed it up so that these were possible, and where does this lead? So I'll take a moment to think about it, reflect on what has led up to this. I'll talk about some of the trends driving some of the change, and then look at opportunities and challenges, and hopefully that leads to Jen's talk in it after me. So if you look at, maybe purely looking at it from a dollars and cents perspective, right? If you look at the life sciences and the healthcare space, and I peeled away all the actual R&D expenses, the core drug development or things like that. And if I focused on technology, AI, tools, infrastructure, which enable a lot of these. If you looked in about 10 years ago, there was venture capital and private equity money was about 20 billion went into funding companies in these, right? Roughly divided half and half between life sciences and healthcare. But if you put the clock forward even 7, 8 years later, which is in 2018 or 2019, that tripled, right, to $60 billion, right? And what has happened is with the pandemic coming, that is expected to double in the course of 1 year, 1.5 years. So by 2021, right? So a big change. Now, typically, when you have that level of investment, what happens is, you're stressing some of the things which are known models, right? Like, what happened in the ride sharing or the other analogous industry is poised to happen in the healthcare and the life sciences space. If you look at the percentage of genetic testing, it was like fairly close to zero a few years ago. It's now 5% of all tests. Similarly, if you look at telehealth, it used to be $25 million in Medicare fee-for-service type of thing, but with the pandemic that has driven it up quite a bit, right? And even if you looked at AI-based companies, there were about 180 of those doing drug discovery type of thing. That's expected to double in a year. So what's fueling all that, right? So if you peel back and look at it, there are 3 or 4 things. I won't cover every single aspect, but 3 or 4 things just to spur a discussion, right? Number one is the amount of data being generated by all these new technologies has gone up tremendously. Like, I'll give you an example from wearables or connected devices or implantables. There's a ton of data coming from there. On the robotics and IoT side, they are generating a lot of data. right, within the supply chain or drug screening, any of those areas. The third thing is digitization and standardization of a lot of data, healthcare data through electronic health records, prescription data, or imaging data, which is all coming together, right? Again, structured and unstructured data coming together. So the number one thing is the explosion in data, which is enabling us to do interesting things, which I'll come up in just a second. And then the other thing that has helped some of this data is changes in regulations, right? Like the 2016 Cures Act in the life sciences allowed data to come in from a lot of these connected devices as part of filings, right? That drug filings, that was one. There were other things like, the FDA allowing real world data or real world evidence as part of the clinical trial submissions. So those kinds of regulatory things have helped them quite a bit. The second thing which is there is infrastructure-wise, right? Like cloud computing and the tool sets which come along with it have come a long ways with that investment, tripling over the last few years, right? So what these have made is transacting with the data has become much easier. It's much easier to spin up applications or test or things like that. So essentially what this infrastructure has done is it democratized development as well as accelerated and innovation, right? So it's not only AWS, Azure, or things like that, but you're also looking at a stack of tools which are sitting on top of these, right? Like things to analyze patterns, the AI, ML tools, machine learning type of tools, which are allowing for longitudinal analysis of data. So there's a stack of tools which has come out. Right? So if you look at it, the data, the tools, that has spurred a lot of this and teed it up. So where is the opportunity, right? Like, given this, think about a couple of facts, right? Like 80% of the US population is going to have smartphones, right? Like, iOS or Android operating systems are going to be there with them, right? And if you look at the amount of data now that a particular patient, if you look at the average timeline of over their life, if you just looked at clinical data or non-modifiable, genetic data and things like that, that's about, on an average, about 6 terabytes worth of data over a year. But if you factor in behavioral data, social determinants of health, that's about 1,200 terabytes of data, right? So the data explosion is coming, right? So with that, it brings a lot of opportunities. Personalized care, longitudinal care of patients is one area, right? Integrations of behavioral data, home care, and bringing in your clinical care, etc. That's one. The analytics, insights into patients, right? Device-enabled cognitive behaviors, mental health, behavioral health type of opportunities. So everything around personalized care and like the whole 360-degree view of the patient, that's an area of opportunity. Now, if you switch to like core pharmaceutical or life sciences R&D, access to this data has enabled things like interesting business models around like, patient recruitment by mining a lot of healthcare data to identify patients who may be a better match to clinical trials as opposed to doing ad hoc matching. You could do clinical trial design. You could do decentralized trials. Now with COVID, what that has proved is like, the trials need to go to the patient as opposed to the patient coming to physical locations, right? And that brings up interesting opportunities. The opportunities on the supply chain side, right? Better tracking of the supply chain, cold chain, and other types of things that are opportunities. But all these opportunities, so if you look at the infrastructure layer, the data layer, and then if you lay it on the last mile, right? That's where the opportunities are in terms of creating functionality. And if you look at the $5.5 trillion in the healthcare thing, I think one of the consulting firms estimated that 10% of that is going to be coming out of new business models and new use cases in all these areas over the next 5 years. That's $500 billion or so, right? So there's tremendous amount of opportunity. But all these come with challenges, right? The minute you are exploring the data, putting it out there, patient consent becomes an issue. Patient data privacy becomes an issue. How do you consent? Who owns the data? These are all become issues, right? So I'll pause there and maybe hand it off. So I just wanted to talk about how that journey has come about. It wasn't like instantaneous that all these occurred. We needed to set all these up over the last 8 or 10 years so that now over the next 5 to 7 years, a lot of growth, exponential growth can happen. And COVID has certainly accelerated that.
Certainly,
Thanks.
yeah. And I think that what's interesting is with this confluence of all this, we have to make sure that at what cost, right? And who will we leave behind with all of this access to the data? That leads us right into Jen Horonjeff, our next speaker. She's the founder and CEO of Savvy Collaborative, which is the first patient-owned and only patient-owned cooperative that helps innovators connect directly to diverse patients. Jen is a fierce force. She has been a patient and knows exactly what it means to be an advocate for direct patient care. A human factors engineer by training and an FDA advisor, Jen is going to speak to us about the patient side. So I will hand it off to Jen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a great discussion. I certainly am going to talk to you a little bit about the patient lens. I've seen it from both sides as both a patient myself with many chronic illnesses ever since I was an infant. But then also I went onto the professional side, as Rupal mentioned, as a human factors engineer, as a qualitative researcher, and really saw this disconnect from people who are doing the innovations, who mean well. They're fabulous people like yourselves that are paying attention and want to create better things that are going to improve the lives of patients. But the problem is just any one person lacks all the necessary knowledge to create innovations that will make a meaningful impact on diverse individuals. And so this is really where Savvy was born out of, was sort of this discomfort around when people would ask me to speak on behalf of all of patients with my condition. It felt very uncomfortable because I lacked that perspective as somebody who is white with a PhD living in New York City, cannot speak possibly on behalf of everybody. And I think that we are seeing this more and more in 2020 becoming an issue, and for people starting to wake up to these issues, both around how are we going to conduct care in a world that looks very different than when it was initially developed, but then also around a lot of racial injustices and other things that we need to be really, really mindful of as we create new innovations. And so that's why, what I spend my days and nights and every waking moment doing is telling people to do just this. Like, ask patients, like, don't think you have to exist in a vacuum and guess what they need. The best way to move innovations forward is if we work together. And we saw this certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, where we rushed, because we needed to put telehealth out into the market at a much larger scale than originally was, to create new innovations. All of a sudden, people cared about decentralized trials and how can we bring trials to the participants themselves rather than make them fly all around the world to participate. And so these things are possible, but we put them out there like that really fast. Again, I know that we do not have the luxury of time, but the problem when we do that is that we could be leaving behind a lot of people because we don't understand what their needs and priorities may be. I think this is also something we need to be thinking about specifically around digital, which certainly has the opportunity to democratize healthcare and bring more opportunities. But we need to understand not just about who has access to smartphones or things that they might need wearables to accomplish said activities to maintain their health, but the fact that these things do not work together. And this is the problem with so many health innovations, even outside of digital. It's just the people are creating innovations in their own space and silos. They launch them out to the patient. The patient is expected to know how to use them, learn how to use them, and fit into their lives somehow, create time and space to do these things. And they rarely talk together. And that is such a huge burden on the patient. And then we call them non-compliant. We say, you do not care about taking care of your health. You are a bad patient. What else can we do? Well, you didn't do the work from the beginning. So how are we going to now blame them? This drives me bananas. And so we need to do a better job through the innovation process to loop patients in. I mean, I believe I shared one of these stories with the participants, the other panelists as we were chatting before, but I'll tell you my own story recently around having access to my health data that made it, or lack thereof, that made it impossible for me to maintain my care because I have about 1,000, well, realistically, I think I have 6 or 7 different patient portal apps because I have a lot of chronic illnesses, so I see specialists at different locations. They do all have the same backend from a major electronic health record provider, yet they don't all speak together. And so I had a specialty appointment that was scheduled and had been scheduled like 6 months in advance. It came time for that appointment. They needed my records. Great, I've got them. I've got them on my Apple Health Kit and all my apps. I have all my records, but they don't have my physician notes because patients don't get those. So I was then told I needed to, of course, send in faxes to said, provider. They would then send me a CD-ROM, which of course I don't have access to do anything with. And then that would ultimately go to the new specialist. And in a small window of time, this was not able to be done. And I had to cancel that appointment that I had booked like a good patient 6 months in advance. So I was trying to do everything right, but the system failed me. I didn't fail my own care plan. So that is sort of what we want to drive home is if we aren't talking to those patients, and again, diverse patients with different needs and different experiences, then we're really not going to meaningfully move the needle forward.
Thank you, Jen. That's just really important. Like, who is this for? We're all in healthcare for the patient at the end of the day, right? And life sciences, but are we really doing that when we start having sort of when you start forgetting that is actually for that individual? You see it as a system rather than at the individual level. So how do we do better? How do we do better? Evan Falchuk is here to tell us how we do better. Big shoes to fill, Evan. But Evan is the chairman and CEO of Village Plan, which is a telehealth benefit. He's also a business and political entrepreneur focused on a better health future. He's also an attorney, much like Stas, but also has spent a lot of time on the entrepreneurial side. And later, one of his company's best doctors was acquired by Teladoc Health. So Evan, take it away to tell us more about how we build a better future.
Thanks. So the question that I think of in my own journey as an entrepreneur, and I've been an entrepreneur in both healthcare and in politics. I went and ran for governor of Massachusetts back in 2014 and just was the chairman of the ballot initiative that didn't win to establish ranked choice voting in Massachusetts. And so I've seen from the standpoint of both politics and from healthcare, the many challenges that we face. And look, I know that we're in a time of a deep questioning about what's going on in our country. Also creates opportunities. And I have to say that I feel a tremendous sense of optimism of what the future can look like because of the spirit of the people that I've encountered through these entrepreneurial efforts. I think that one thing that Americans just culturally we're really good at is coming up with entrepreneurial solutions to problems. We can spot an issue, we can figure out a way to make money off of fixing it. And in that way, we sort of crowdsource the future. I think that's a very special thing that Americans are as a culture, we're very good at. I think one thing we're not very good at is planning for the future, deciding what we want it to look like. And I think it was Churchill that said that Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other alternatives. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it doesn't have to be that way. And especially it's the case in healthcare. The future that exists is going to be the one that we build when it comes to healthcare. And what I want to raise and challenge all of us to do as we go through this day and thinking about what does the future of healthcare look like is to put aside perhaps the preconceived notions of, okay, I am tied to a particular solution to this problem, that's all there can be, and instead say, what do I want the outcome to look like? And then let's see if there's other solutions that we can use. There's times where we've done that in our country. I mean, the moon landings, which are, incredible to believe is, half a century ago. But President Kennedy said, we're going to go and do this. And the technology didn't exist in 1961 when he was talking about this. But the vision existed, and the will to do so, and the ability for people to work together existed. I don't think, and this isn't a political statement, I don't think there's any doubt that we're not in the same place as a country as we were back then, but people are still doing these things, entrepreneurs. And I was really inspired recently by the work, the CASP experiment, which is the critical analysis of protein structure, that recently came out with a result using AI from Google that was able to determine the structure of the folding structure of a protein in a period of time that was unimaginable. That project started as a challenge, like one of these, future challenges back in 1994, where they said, is it possible for us to run what they called an experiment to see if it's possible to use newly developing technologies to solve this problem of how do we characterize the structure of a protein? And it's 26 years since that project started, but they've had a result which is potentially game-changing for drug development and other applications, caused by people having a vision and saying, I'm going to start a project that I do not know when it will be finished. I will do what they used to say, plant trees under whose shadow I will not sit. And there's a vision that is tied to that, which is the mother and father of innovation. So we're going to have a session that I'll be quarterbacking or curating or facilitating, whatever the right word is for it, about what the healthcare system looks like in the 22nd century. And it's not a typo to say the 22nd century. It's because I think that if we can start to think about what do things look like in a time period that's beyond our ability to imagine, we can actually imagine some things that maybe are within our ability to achieve. So I'm honored to be here. I've had a great deal of admiration for the work that's being done at the Bouvet College of Health Sciences, and I'm especially privileged to be here with this incredible panel and all the rest of you. So, thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, challenging us to think big, I think, which is really exciting as we go into the afternoon. So we have actually another 10 minutes or so to take questions and to spark a conversation with the four of you. You all had your unique perspectives of what 2020 and looked like and why it came to be, and what we want and expect for 2021 and beyond to be. So I'd love to start getting a conversation going initially amongst the four of you, and then we'll invite others to also start having sending in their questions so I can moderate those. Anyone want to start? Go ahead.
Yeah, so what Jen brought up, I think, was some interesting thoughts there, right? You want to increase the diversity of, you want to increase access to patients, right? It's a chicken and egg problem, right? You want to increase access to patients for either clinical trial or medical care or any of those type of thing, right? But some of the things that are required for that, right? Take an example of access to emerging trials or things like that. You want the diversity of the population, but yet in order to influence that, you really need the participation of a lot of data, participation from that same patient pool. Which one, in what order do you think of that? That's a big challenge, actually, always.
Well, I think when it comes to things like trials, which we know there is such a lack of diversity in the participants, what we hear over and over again from different communities of color is they just want to be involved earlier. That I think in clinical research or in sort of the pharma industry, we think of the clinical trial as the end all be all of that is the main objective. Let's get them in the trial. But there's so many other ways that an individual can participate and influence change in a product development pipeline that is way before or after a clinical trial, be it developing and working with them around protocols and feasibility, or would you want another app? What is this marketing campaign? Is it going to be offensive to certain communities? And we've worked with many, many companies where they have learned that yes, it is. And so I think that is how we start to regain trust, or at least that's what what we're hearing from the community when we do this kind of work, that they want to know that their voice is being listened to before they're now a test subject. There are other ways to get involved that is not just as a sort of passive participant.
Yes, that's actually really true in terms of the vaccine right now, right? We know that there are certain demographics that are really historically have been against vaccines. And so how does public health, and actually to push it back to you maybe, Evan, like thinking about what is the role of leaders, public leaders, in terms of getting that word out and helping the process of healthcare, making trust in that?
Yeah, we've got a pretty serious problem with trust right now, and I think one of the interesting challenges that exist with healthcare is that patients are increasingly sophisticated, which is a really good thing, the other side of that is that there's a lot of people out there that just don't trust experts anymore. So if a doctor says this vaccine is good and safe, I'm going to say that no, it's not, and my opinion is just as good as her opinion, even though she's a physician and I'm just some guy. That's a problem, and I think that one of the challenges we face from a political leadership perspective is that kind of short-term thinking that we often see, where there's political gain to be had by playing to people who want to basically disagree with and criticize experts. So I think what we need to have is a renewal of the notion that experts actually know what they're talking about, and that we want to engage patients who are themselves expert in what's best for them, in a world in which the treatments and everything else are going to be increasingly focused on that individual's individual condition, their genetic makeup, and everything else like it. So we need leaders to focus on helping individuals do the right things for themselves, and not playing to our worst, the worst angels of our nature.
And Stas, I want to bring you into this conversation as well in terms of your CIC, right? You're sitting on an innovation incubator, right? There's a ton of tech that is being developed there. How do we engage those people if they're not doing health right now, just the way CIC pivoted, to play a role, given that it is such a unprecedented time in our lifetime?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think a big part of it is rolling out, I think the welcome mat is critical. And this is, I think, a derivative of Jen's point. So just as the point, just as it matters to say to folks, your innovation, you are welcome in the innovation community, and innovation is for you. Part of that message actually needs to go to entrepreneurs. And it's funny because entrepreneurs tend to be the people who like raise their hand when nobody else has their hand up and say, me, I'll do it. But even in that group, when you compare the difficulty of getting things to change in healthcare versus some other fields, and entrepreneurs are kind of battling around ideas and thinking about, okay, where do I put in my energies next? The highly regulated fields, although they're highly regulated for very good reason, oftentimes that regulation can be a barrier to early stage question asking around, is this the way things should be? And part of it, I think the financial industry has started playing around with the idea of sandboxes, which is, can I make a small space for you to experiment before all the big rules apply to you? So if you want to work on some kind of new innovation, you don't have to follow the same rules as Bank of America or Citigroup until you get to maybe be this a little bit bigger. And it's much more difficult, of course, to do that in healthcare because the stakes are high and lives are at stake. But at the same time, there can be a little bit more flexibility around what does it mean? So I know one of the things that CAC Health has dealt with as a challenge over the last year is there's when you're working on COVID testing, every COVID test has to be prescribed by a physician. In most states, that's the running, that's the law of the state, and the running set of regulations. So that means that if you're trying to bring down the cost of testing and bring up the availability, you have to think about, okay, how do I optimize physician prescribing in a way that works, but also doesn't get a physician in trouble so that they don't do the work too quickly? But also, how do you get a cost down if you have to bring in a physician and all the attendant costs associated with that? And the physician has to think about their risk and their practice and their license. Those are the kind of things that then come and play a significant role. I think actually the point that Evan made earlier was interesting, and I want to push back on it a little bit, Evan, hopefully you don't mind. And this is the idea, when you think about the way innovation happens around expertise. So expertise is, I think, a double-edged sword. It's useful to have expertise, but sometimes the experts are just really wrong. And so what that doesn't mean is we should say, vaccines are a terrible idea, because that's wrong. But I think we can think about completely crazy approaches to solving problems that might just work, and figure out a regulatory space for that to happen, and a procedural space that says groundbreaking innovations aren't only for a small group of people, but this is, I think Jen's question is, who are we doing this for, and who's included in the conversation, making sure that we can make those available. So if you think about one of my kind of favorite examples, if you look at electric cars, what everyone said was impossible in 1999 about electric cars, what everyone said would take 70 years, except a very small group of people. If you said to the people in 1999, if you ask them, where are the most interesting electric car innovations going to come from? They would have said, maybe, if they were sort of trapped in normal thinking, they would say it would be the car companies, right? And maybe a smaller breakthrough car company, but a car company, right? And people who are thinking about this more broadly might have said, well, Apple will do something really cool in that world. Well, people, if there's an iMac, remember the iMac from the 90s, maybe the iMac will become a car. I don't think anybody was saying to you, you know who it will be? It will be the entrepreneur who invents PayPal. Like, that's the person who's going to build the most interesting electric car. Like, that's the person who's going to rewrite the map on how solar power is delivered in the United States. And that person, by the way, is also going to help us get to the stars faster and cheaper. And so I think there's this idea that the experts in all of those fields said the things that are happening now in 2020 are not possible. And so there's this interesting dichotomy between, okay, we want to lean heavily on experts. We don't want to say anybody with an opinion has an equally good one, but also pair that with challenging assumptions that we take for granted about how things can and should be done in order to make the revolutionary changes. And that's how you roll out the welcome mat to entrepreneurs, is you say, we're open for that conversation. Because if you say we're not open, then the entrepreneurs go innovate in another field, and we miss out in healthcare on some of the innovations that are happening. We have the problem that Jen is having, where she has 7 different apps tying to the same interface, but not one that can actually solve the problems that she has.
Evan, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think I love what you're saying, and I think it's right. And I'm always a big fan. I mean, certainly, look, if you go and you do something like run for office as an independent, or try to change the law of how we elect people, you got to be willing to do stuff that other people say is crazy. And I think that people that do stuff like what you were talking about, Elon Musk, it's awesome. And part of the problem that entrepreneurs are so great at solving is the idea that the conventional wisdom tells me this isn't possible to do. Well, those people are wrong, and I'm going to go prove it. And I think that, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I think that the flip side of it can be sometimes, and I think this is what we're seeing, kind of the balance going in the wrong direction, is saying, you know what, it's not just that the conventional wisdom is wrong, it's that anybody who has wisdom is wrong. And that's where we get into this dangerous place. But I'm with you totally. I mean, innovation is really is the thing that propels us forward, and it doesn't happen by accident. It's because people stick their necks out and do stuff that other people think is crazy. And we should encourage that at every turn.
And can I just pop in with one more thing? That doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't call entrepreneurs crazy when they say crazy things or do crazy things. I'm not a fan of Elon Musk as a person, because I think he's done some really crazy things. And so it's important to be able to call out bad behavior separately from somebody's contribution in the innovation space. I think we can look at Steve Jobs and say he had some tremendous impact on technology, and maybe he wasn't the best family guy, right? We can look at that, and we can be honest about these conversations and about the impact that individuals have, and do it without hero worship, but also recognize that there are structural challenges around innovation and entrepreneurship. And we don't want, we've seen in the world of physics that some of our most talented physics PhDs go to equity trading on Wall Street because they're not feeling like they have that kind of impact. I think we should want to stay away from that innovation. We don't want our smartest people building another software tool when we can ask them to build healthcare and robotics and so on and so forth.
And that's we're here at Northeastern today and having these discussions, or virtually at least, and interdisciplinary and experiential innovation is really at the heart of what we believe in. And so I think this has been an awesome discussion. We could probably go on for hours, but we are going to actually now transition into the breakout sessions. So let me just tell you a little bit about the breakout sessions. There are 3 breakout sessions that you can choose from in the first session. So there'll be one from 2 to 2:25. There'll be another from 2:30 to 2:55, and then the last one from 3 until 3:30. So it just gives you a chance to actually have more small group discussions, and this is where we invite everyone to have discussion. We saw that Viraj, Ben, and Jen were all having a discussion around telehealth in the chat. That was great. Hopefully you guys can have a chance to have that more verbally in the next session. So we're going to go into a bio break from 1:55 to 2. During that time, we are going to put you into breakout rooms. Those breakout rooms were decided based on if you gave us some preferences when the emails came out yesterday to tell us which session you were interested in. If not, you'll be asked you'll be prompted to see which one you'd like to be in. Sometimes, like I said earlier, we might have to just put you in different rooms so that we've got sort of an equal balance. So we have 3 breakouts coming up. The breakouts coming up now in the 3 rooms. Room number 1 will be led by Rebecca Love, which is the topic there is going to be about health and life sciences working together to create resilience across the lifespan. The second one will be led by Neil Menier. Neil's session is going to be about eliminating global health disparities and creating health equity. And the last one, room 3, will be Lynn Reed, leading a discussion around the impact of technology on the delivery of healthcare in the changing world. So we invite you to take a bio break, whatever you need to, and get your mind ready for the next session for the breakout sessions. And thank you very much to all of our panelists today. This was an awesome discussion, and I hope that, I know Jen, you've got to leave, but Satish, Stas, and Evan are going to be leading some of the breakouts later on. So again, thank you so much for your time today.